It was a day that would change my life forever. It was the day my young wife died suddenly and unexpectedly of a heart attack. What would happen in the days and weeks and months that would follow would catch me completely by surprise, because that day I started on a grief journey. We're going to think about that grief journey in our program, Living with Loss. Welcome to Living with Loss. My name is Bill Webster, and we're going to think about one of the most difficult human experiences. I realize you may be watching this program at a very difficult time in your life. Perhaps someone you care about has died. Perhaps you've experienced a significant loss. Perhaps you're struggling with many emotions and unusual, uncharacteristic behaviors and reactions. But perhaps you're thinking, well, who is this Bill Webster? And even more especially, what does he know about grief? Well, the reality is, I learned about grief the hard way because I experienced it. I suppose you could say I met my wife Carolyn by accident. Both of us were students in London, England. And one of the things I used to do as a student was to play for the college rugby team. Now, we didn't take the sport too seriously. It was just a bunch of guys who got together once a week for some exercise. But on this particular occasion, we were playing against a rival college, and things got a little bit heated. One or two fellas had been hurt in the first half of the game and had gone off to hospital. I remember in the second half seeing the rugby ball coming towards me, and as I caught it, there was a tremendous impact came from behind, and I have a vague recollection of the ground coming up to meet my face with an alarming rate of speed. The next thing I remember, I was being carried off the field on a stretcher, off to the hospital, where I was told that I had a concussion. I spent my first night in the college infirmary, and the very next morning there was a knock on the door, and I ask you to accept what I'm about to tell you because it's true. The door opened, and in walked an angel, carrying my breakfast tray. That was the first time I had ever seen Carolyn. And you know what? It was an immediate revelation that this was the woman I wanted to marry. Now, it may be a bit of a surprise to some to learn that when Carolyn came into that room and saw me sitting there, that wounded warrior of the rugby field, she was not struck with a similar revelation. She didn't immediately think, the man of my dreams, the man I want to marry. In fact, she was quite unimpressed that grown men would chase around a rugby field after an inflated pigskin, knocking each other to the ground and causing concussion. But by that Christmas, I knew that I knew what I wanted. And so I telephoned her, and in the course of the conversation, I asked her if she would consider becoming my wife. And to my great joy, she said that she would. And so that next summer, I came out to Canada. We were married, and it was really quite wonderful because in a very short period of time, so many things in my life just came together. I met and married the woman of my dreams. I had a career. I'd graduated. Our first son was born a couple of years after we were married. 2 years after that, our second son was born, and it seemed that all we had to do was to live happily ever after. Because that's what most of us expect, isn't it? The beautiful princess meets the handsome prince, and their eyes meet, and their hands touch, and they kiss, and they marry, and The benediction on the relationship is that they lived happily ever after. And most of us would like to think that we're going to live happily ever after. Oh, we know that life isn't perfect. We know that life doesn't always work out in exactly the way we expect, but at least we hope that it's going to work out in a way that makes sense, in a way that's meaningful. But sometimes life doesn't work out as we expect. Robbie Burns, the Scottish poet, once said, "The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang after gley, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy." I thought we were going to live happily ever after, or at least I thought we had as good a chance as anybody of living happily ever after and life working out. But in 1983, something happened that was going to change my life forever. The morning began like any other morning. We got up around 7 o'clock. Carolyn went downstairs to get the coffee going. I went through to get our two boys, who at that time were 9 and 7 years of age, out of bed and ready for school. But when I came downstairs, I found to my alarm that Carolyn was on the floor of our kitchen, suffering what seemed to be a seizure. Carolyn had had a number of medical challenges before, but this was something I hadn't seen before. I called 911, the ambulance took her off to the hospital, and I remember driving to the hospital in my car, calmly assuring myself that everything would be fine, everything would be okay, because yes, tragedies occur, but they happen to other people. They happen over there. They don't happen to me. Somehow we feel that we are immune from some of the difficulties and the tragedies of life. But when I got to the hospital, I was met there by a doctor and by a chaplain who took me into a little room. The doctor told me the situation was very serious. Well, I thanked him very kindly, and we went on talking about everything and anything. But the doctor went out and came back a second time and told me by now that the situation was very critical. Looking back, I believe that he was really trying to prepare me for something, but somehow it was just going right over my head. But a third time the doctor came in and simply sat down, and in 4 words, my life was changed forever. Because the words the doctor said were,
that your wife has died.
Your wife has died. What I thought was a seizure turned out to be a heart attack. Carolyn was dead. It just didn't seem possible. I remember going home and thinking that it was all a big misunderstanding. It was all a big mistake. Every time the telephone rang, I rushed to the phone expecting it would be the hospital to tell me that it really wasn't my wife that had died, that it was someone else. Or maybe that car driving outside my house was a cab bringing her home. It would all be a big misunderstanding. Maybe it was a joke. All right, it would be a cruel joke, but just as long as this wasn't happening. And then I realized, wait a minute, I know what's happening. This is a bad dream. I'm having a nightmare. I'm going to waken up at any minute and discover to my relief that this hasn't really happened. But it had happened. And yet there was a sense of unreality about the situation. At first, I guess I was really numb. I was in shock. All through the time of the funeral, people came up to me and said, "Oh, you're doing well. Boy, you're strong." But in fact, I wasn't strong. I was numb. I was in shock. And the problem was that 2 or 3 months after my wife died, at a time when people perhaps thought I should be getting myself together, I felt like I was falling apart. It wasn't long before the numbness began to wear off. and I began to experience what I can only describe as an avalanche of emotions and feelings in reaction to my loss. Some days were very difficult. Some days it seemed like I was in the shadows. Other days seemed a little brighter. 3 months after my wife died, at a time when people thought I should be getting myself together, I felt like I was falling apart. I was experiencing many unusual and uncharacteristic behaviors and emotions, feelings that I didn't even know I had. I didn't realize that what was happening was that I was on a grief journey. This was a grief process. The problem is, we haven't learned in our culture what grief is and what we should expect. And so grief inevitably catches us by surprise. And indeed, what happened to me took me totally by surprise. I found I couldn't concentrate. I'd be talking to someone and all of a sudden my mind would wander. I felt very confused. I was forgetful. I would forget appointments. I would forget where I was supposed to be at a certain time. Not just that it had slipped my mind, I'd forget altogether what I was supposed to be doing. I found it difficult to make decisions. So many unusual things. I found that I was tired and fatigued all the time. I didn't seem to have any energy. I found that I was anxious. I worried about things that normally I would have taken in stride. There was a sense of unreality about the whole situation. I didn't feel like I was in my right mind. There were days that I felt very anxious, not worrying about life-changing decisions or life-changing events, worrying about little things. How would I manage to get through the housework or the household chores or get some groceries? Everyday things that became like Herculean labors. I felt very vulnerable. My 2 boys were 9 and 7 when their mom died. It was the summertime. You know what kids are like. They'd go off swimming or on their bicycles, doing this, doing that. Every time they went out, I would worry about their safety. I'd worry about what I would do if something were to happen to them or to someone else in my circle. It felt like something worse was going to take place. After all, when the worst thing that you can possibly imagine happens, what else can happen? And in that situation, you feel like just about anything can happen. I also felt very irritable. I was grouchy. I was out of sorts with people, with life, with just about everything. Friends would say something and I would take it all the wrong way and get all upset, and it just seemed that everything was all wrong that summer. All these emotions, all these feelings, struggling with guilt and with anger and with loneliness and with depression. I now know that what I was experiencing was not unusual. In fact, what I was experiencing was grief. Grief is a normal response to a significant loss. The problem, of course, is that because we haven't understood it, because we haven't taken time to validate the experiences of grief, the emotions, the tears, the crying, all of these many things, it inevitably catches us by surprise. If there was one emotion that I didn't want to experience, it was crying. But you know what? At 9:30 in the morning, 11 o'clock at night, I would find myself breaking into tears, whether I liked it or not, whether I tried to control myself or not. It was so uncharacteristic. I thought I was falling apart, but in fact, I was experiencing grief. See, one of the things I've had to learn is that tears are not a sign of weakness. Tears are actually a sign of how special and significant the relationship really was. How awful it would be if someone you cared about died and you didn't shed a tear. You went on as if nothing had happened. Life goes on. Got to be strong. These are sometimes the sentiments that people express to us, to pull ourselves together, to be strong, that life must go on. But in many ways they're unrealistic, because what we're experiencing is grief. 3 months after Carolyn died, I felt worse than I did on the day of her death. I felt like I was falling apart. I felt like I was losing my mind. I really thought I was going crazy. But what I was experiencing was grief. What I'd like to suggest to you is that grief is a normal reaction to a significant loss. Now, just because it's normal doesn't mean it isn't difficult. It's perhaps one of the most difficult experiences of life. But this was grief, and I was going through the valley of the shadow. Grief has been described as a journey that often takes much longer than people expect, a journey filled with many surprises, many twists and turns and detours. In fact, someone described grief as like going through a long, dark valley, sometimes in darkness, sometimes in the light, always unpredictable, but a journey. And part of a journey is that we're always trying to move forward. One of my significant learnings was that grief takes time. Just how long depends on each and every individual. John Donne, the English poet, once said, "He who has no time to mourn has no time to mend." But after we've been through the valley, there comes a time when we begin to emerge. And we need to begin to find bridges that are going to lead back to wholeness and to healing. Sometimes the bridges aren't very smooth. Sometimes they're pretty rough and ready. But these are the kind of bridges that we need to find. So let's think about what we can learn from this experience and how we can begin to build bridges back to living again. I think in our culture we sometimes regard grief as being something of a sickness or a disease. After all, people tell us to pull ourselves together to get over it. They tell us, you mustn't cry. But grief is normal. Now, saying that it's normal doesn't minimize its difficulty. Perhaps we might better say it's natural. When someone you care about dies, or you have a significant loss, you're going to grieve. Grief is a response to that loss. It is what teaches us that life is different, that life has changed, and yet that life will go on. So I would like to encourage you to give yourself permission to grieve. You may be going through a very difficult period right now. Even as you're watching this program, life may be very difficult for you. Give yourself permission to grieve. And in that grieving, you'll begin to find the way to healing and to wholeness. I realize that many of you have had different kinds of losses. Sometimes people ask me, what's the worst kind of loss? Is it worse to lose a spouse or a child? Is it worse to lose someone suddenly or to lose someone after a long illness? What's the worst kind of loss? The answer, I guess, is that the worst kind of loss is yours. Because for you, you may feel like this is the worst thing that could have possibly happened. And so I think it's important to legitimize the fact that this is a very difficult experience, and it does take time to get through that experience. Of course, sometimes people say time heals, but in fact time doesn't heal anything. It's what you do with that time that enables you to heal. Sometimes people say, how am I going to get over this experience? Or, when am I going to get over this experience? There's a sense in which we don't get over it, we go through it. We can't go around it, we can't go under it. Sometimes in our culture, people try to move us away from pain, move us away from grief. They tell us not to grieve, not to cry. But I believe the way to healing is to find the courage to go through the experience, to say, yes, I've had a loss. Yes, my life has changed, but what can I learn from this? And how can I go on? One of the things that brought me some comfort in the days that followed Carolyn's death were the words in the 23rd Psalm that says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. This verse tells us at least three things about the grieving process. The first thing it tells us is that it's a shadow. Just as we were walking a few minutes ago in the shadow, the psalm describes the experience as a shadow. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but you can't have a shadow without there being a light somewhere. Now, don't worry. I'm not going to give you any cliches about the light at the end of the tunnel, because I'm sure if you're anything like I was, there will be many days when it seems like someone has put out the light at the end of the tunnel. But it's a shadow. And maybe some way down the road, maybe when you're able to see this experience in a different perspective, you'll be able to see it in a new light. It also teaches us that we don't have to go it alone. We can feel the comforting presence of God. Perhaps there's a support program or a support group that we can put you in touch with that'll help you to work through some of the issues of your loss. Don't try to go it alone. Try to find someone who understands, who can sympathize. Perhaps not everyone can. But don't go it alone. And the final thing the psalm teaches us is that you're going to come through this experience. Even though I walk through the valley, we don't get stuck in the valley. We don't get lost in the valley. The valley isn't a dead-end street. You're going to come through this experience. I'm so glad you've been able to join us for this program in our series, Living with Loss. I have shared with you my own personal story of how grief impacted my life and some of my reactions after the death of my wife. Of course, I realize that you may be watching this and you are living with a very different kind of situation. Death is not the only loss that leads to grief. Perhaps it's the end of a relationship through separation, breakup, or divorce. Perhaps a great friend or your kids have moved away and you miss all that relationship had to offer. Not only what you got from it, but what you invested in it. Perhaps you've lost a job, or you've had to sell your house or give up a business. Perhaps you are struggling with the grief of unmet expectations. Life hasn't worked out as you expected. Some of your hopes and dreams of the way life would be have been shaken and challenged. Whatever the situation and whatever the loss, often it is difficult to make sense of it all. Life doesn't seem fair. Well, the reality is life sometimes isn't fair. In fact, life is difficult. In this life, loss is inevitable. But what we do about it is always a choice. I hope that in those difficult moments, we can help you choose life and bring some sense of hope that life can go on. For those of you who have lost someone recently to death, we would like to offer you, without compliments, this little booklet that I've written entitled Now What? Just write to us at Living with Loss, P.O. Box 430, Brampton, Ontario, L6V 2L4, and we'll send it to you free of charge. We hope it'll bring some comfort at this difficult time. We can also let you know about support programs and services in your community. And may we simply say that portions of this program each week are viewer-supported. And if you can assist us financially with the program, we will appreciate it. You can write to us at the same address, and please make your check out to Living with Loss to ensure you receive your charitable receipt. I have found that there is always hope, and that can help us find the courage and determination to go on. Admittedly, there are no easy answers, and sometimes no obvious answers at all. But it is possible to make it through this difficult experience. And I would like to do what I can to help you make it through that journey. So let me leave you with this final thought from Viktor Frankl. To live is to suffer. To survive is to find meaning in the suffering. Thank you for watching. Be good to yourself, and always remember, someone cares.